So my name is Caitriona Devery. I'm the research manager here at the Earth Institute, and welcome to this morning's coffee morning. I'm here to share the session and introduce Dr. Shane McGuinness. So today we have Dr. McGuinness, who's going to talk about the newly started, very exciting Horizon 2020 Green Deal funded project WaterLANds, which is subtitled Water-Based Solutions for Carbon Storage, People and Wilderness. So it's a very large-scale multi-partner European project, which UCD is leading on, and it aims to restore wetland sites across Europe and lay the foundations for upscaling this work to other areas. So it's led by Dr. Craig Bullock as the coordinator and Shane McGuinness as deputy coordinator. So Shane, you're very welcome here today, and saw this project at application stage, so it's very exciting to see it come to fruition and to start. We had the kickoff meeting earlier in January, so I'm very much looking forward to working with Shane and Craig on the project. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Shane before I hand over. So Dr. Shane McGuinness is a conservation biologist by training, specializing in human-wildlife conflict, biodiversity finance, and environmental education. And Shane has broad experience with NGOs, academia, and the private sector, and he's worked on projects such as wind energy conflict and protected birds. He's mapped conservation conflict with road construction, and he's measured the impact of gorillas on farms in Rwanda. He's also, which is going to come in very handy, experience of coordinating national and international partner networks, developing a biodiversity financial needs assessment for Ireland, and he's coordinated the Peatland Finance Ireland project. So I'll hand over to Shane to tell us all about the WaterLANds project. And if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, or we can take them after after Shane's presentation. Thanks, Shane.
Lovely. Thanks, Caitriona, and good morning, all. Apologies in advance because Murphy's Law, the bin truck has just arrived outside, so I'll do my best to try and cover that up. Right, we'll move on. Thanks for the introduction, Caitriona. Just shout if this isn't moving forward, if you will. Briefly speaking, let's talk about wetlands and how important they are. This graph popped up a couple of weeks ago, data provided by the IPCC. And the most important take home from this graph is the central figure there for wetlands. In terms of carbon storage, we don't necessarily see a lot of the carbon for wetlands, but there's a vast amount of carbon stored in those areas. Way more than most of those much more prominent features like tropical rainforests that we would see around the world. So wetlands are really important. We don't often acknowledge them. In fact, most of the time we see them as wastelands and not wetlands. Moving on, so now we know that wetlands are important. However, and indeed, World Wetlands Day was just yesterday, so it's getting increasing importance, which is brilliant, but it hasn't always had that same importance. So in the last 40 years, we've lost 35% of our wetlands internationally, and that has led to a similar reduction in the biodiversity of these areas. So we've lost 85% of that since the 1700s, that we know about. So given the amount of stuff we don't know around all of this, we've likely lost significantly more than we thought we had before. So wetlands are important. And that's where WaterLANds comes in. The challenge, however, is that wetland degradation, or a total loss of those wetlands, leads to a loss of ecosystem services and biodiversity. WaterLANds aims for the upscaled restoration of this fundamentally. So not just a single small level project-based restoration initiatives, but something that lasts much beyond the project itself. Lots of barriers existing around wetland restoration thus far, or historically. There's socioeconomic factors, there's insufficient stakeholder engagement, there's lack of government commitment, which is, I suppose, linked to the previous one. There's also lack of finance, fundamentally, to achieve this on the ground. And there's also inadequate exchange of knowledge. So there might be lots of data out there, but it may not necessarily be getting to the people that can affect the change. Thus, most restoration to date is with either a single landowner, is at small scale, or is simply done just for conservation purposes alone. And we want to try and change that. Looking at this challenge a bit in more detail, if we wanted to restore, where do we get the water from? Fundamentally, these are wetlands, but there's water required to provide that. How do we get communities behind these previous wastelands? How do we get the support of government bodies to turn these drier lands back into wetter lands? And how do we incentivize stakeholders and mobilize finance for this restoration? So in other words, what we're trying to do is overcome these perceptions, leading to support, investments in this conservation, and ultimately transformational change in restoration of wetlands. WaterLANds itself is a network of 32 partners across 14 countries. It will last for 5 years with a budget of €23.6 million. The UCD team in particular, as Caitriona mentioned earlier, is Craig Bullock as the coordinator, myself as the deputy coordinator, and Louise Dunne as our financial officer. All three of us are in the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy. Caitriona will be helping us out on a particular project around the art aspect of this. Aparajita Banerjee in the School of Business will be a postdoc, a part-time postdoc in this for certain elements, and Florence Renou-Wilson will also be feeding in her expert long-term knowledge on peatlands and carbon, so extremely valuable. Looking at the call that we went for particularly, this was the Green Deal call, area 7.1, focusing on restoring biodiversity and ecosystem services. Total fund of 85 million going for that. And what we needed to do was demonstrate replication or upscaling of restoration, and demonstrate innovation in particular, whether that was restoration methods, governance or finance, and provide sustainability and climate resilience, explore incentive-based mechanisms, scale up nature-based solutions, and engage communities and help them to adapt. Finally then, to also maximize synergies and avoid trade-offs and show how we can inform transformational change like I talked about. As an overview of the project, it's a research and innovation action, so it isn't solely about academia producing lots of publications and reports. It's about action on the ground and doing that in an innovative way. The total budget, as I said, is 23.6 million, 97% of which is EU funded, but that still means that there's over €600,000 of co-financing from various important for-profit institutions, which I'll point out as we go along. Over 60% of this is to be used on on-the-ground restoration. You're not necessarily buying shovels or filling in ditches, but it will be used for affecting on-the-ground restoration. As I said, 32 partners, 14 countries. They spread right across academia, government institutions, NGOs, industry bodies, and community group representatives. It goes across 15 what we call knowledge sites and 6 action sites. And that will lead to initial restoration of over 10,000 hectares of wetlands, but with significant scalability beyond that, so it won't stop there. Importantly, there's 3 other Green Deal awardees in our area 7.1, and we've now clustered them into a group of 4. The other ones are Merlin, so mainstreaming ecological restoration for freshwater related ecosystems in a landscape context, so lots of clunky acronyms there. West Coast, which is large scale restoration of coastal ecosystems, and Superb, whose logo looks suspiciously like the Timberland logo, systemic solutions for upscaling of urgent ecosystem restoration for forest-related biodiversity and ecosystem services. Big, long mouthful there. However, all of us overlap in certain ways, whether it be in terms of the action sites we're using, so the on-the-ground restoration, whether it be the partners involved, or whether it be the governments that we require to engage throughout the process. So we're not working in isolation. Either geographically or ecologically, we are all supporting each other, which is important to say. In terms of our own network, as I said, we've got 6 action sites, as you can see marked on the map here, and we've got 15 knowledge sites. Now, the knowledge sites are not solely ecological in nature. Some of them are financial, some of them are governance, and there's a varying suite of developmental stages there as well. So some of them are long-term 50-year projects like the Camargue or Doñana in Spain. Others are more entry level, where there's still lots of learning to be had, but also cross-pollination of lessons across our network too. Overall, that project vision of transformational change in wetland restoration is founded on 7 key objectives. The first is to provide or demonstrate large-scale upscaling. The second is to identify barriers around this. The third is to foster cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary collaboration. The fourth is to apply a community-led paradigm to this. The fifth is to ensure that relevant past experience informs this future wetland restoration. And number 6 is to provide tailored financial solutions. And 7 is to incubate this legacy beyond the 5-year term of this project. It's based around 4 key foundational pillars, as you can see here. Number 1 is restoring services, 2 engaging communities, 3 aligning governance, and 4 mobilizing finance. All 4 of those feed into work package 5, which is co-creating best practice, and then that's then founded upon restoration management. In other words, actually doing work on the ground. In terms of a slightly different schematic, you can see the progress of this over the next 5 years. The first will be what we call a knowledge cluster. So using those four pillars to co-create this knowledge that we currently got, to then apply that at our action sites in this action cluster, and then to allow that to to grow into a legacy, whether it be governance support or financial incentives, which we certainly will be developing at some of our sites. To look specifically at these action sites, as a reminder, we've got 6 across our network here, and there's the names of them. Details on the knowledge sites on the right here, which I won't go into too much, but just to know that the knowledge sites, as I said before, are spread both socioeconomically, geographically, and ecologically too. They also provide a varying suite of ecosystem services, whether it be carbon sequestration, water provision, recreation, flood defence, etc. The first of our action sites is in Ireland, so the Cuilcagh in Éireann SAC, which is also part of the Life IP Wild Atlantic Nature Project, the logo there in the middle, and that's focusing on Blanket Bog in the north and west of Ireland. So we'll be using one of their SAC sites to in particular implement a results-based agricultural payment scheme to incentivize farmers to change practices and also to adopt some additional measures, whether that be building fences or blocking drains or something else entirely. This is quite new to the rest of our European network. It's not new in Ireland. We've been doing it across Ireland for years now, beginning with the likes of the Burn project. So we're very good at this kind of thing. The rest of our European partners are not. And in fact, it took a bit of convincing to include it in the project. There was a lot of hesitance around that. Our second site is in England, Northern England. It's part of the ICASP project in Yorkshire, so Integrated Catchment Solutions Programme out of the University of Leeds. Another strong partner there is Natural England, and that will also be supported by the knowledge of the IUCN UK peatland programme. So lots of interesting ideas there around both the water provision of these areas, in areas that are highly degraded in the slide here, but also in terms of the potential carbon storage and maybe even valuation and capitalization of that carbon storage potential. The third is in the Netherlands, so the Eems or Ems-de-Laard estuary in between the Netherlands and Germany, and the map on the right there. A very highly engineered area, as you would imagine, being coastal Netherlands. They're trying to transition from this hard edge back to a softer edge, especially with the threat, the impending doom of increasing water levels, but also the other water or ecosystem services that these areas could and maybe should be providing a bit more. So there's one particular project that we'll be using, which is the Twin Dykes project. So this is on the photo on the left here, and it's going to transition from this intensive agriculture hard boundary to a much softer breeding wader area and recreational area. So we'll be helping them achieve that as well. Again, lots of lessons to be learned, but from a coastal perspective. In Estonia, we have the Parnu catchment. I'm just realizing now this slide looks like a military intelligence report. And in a way it kind of is, given it's Eastern Estonia. Important partners involved here, the main one being Tartu University, but also 3 others involved here too. One is the Estonian Fund for Nature, which is an NGO, and then 2 others which are extractive industry. One is the State Forestry Management System or organization, and the second is Tutsi Turvas, which is the equivalent, I suppose, of Bord na Móna over there, so extractive industry. The 3 of those give huge access to a really wide area, but also massive scalability potential there. Similar challenges to the Midlands and Ireland as a comparator. Our fourth site is in Italy. This is the Venice Lagoon. Unusually, this is actually led by a local NGO called We Are Here Venice, who originally started to campaign around the ownership of the city itself, but also the use of the wetland around it, the Banerjee, the salt marshes surrounding the city, and frankly the abuse of all of those towards increased tourism or towards increased commercialization of the area. It's now starting to shift because people are realizing that there is massive value, not least in terms of the protection that these wetlands provide the city, but also the various other ecosystem services that we simply don't understand enough about yet. So really motivated there, massive scalability, and also incredible support of the local government, the Provveditorato, which I've likely butchered there. So again, important to see the governance implementation. In Bulgaria then, we've got the Dragoman Marsh, which is a karst wetland environment. It's part of a much larger Ramsar site. Highly fragmented, and this is the really interesting part about this particular site, because it is former Soviet drained agricultural area, and it's since reverted back to a partial wetland. But as a result of that, there's this highly fragmented nature you can see on the map on the right here. And that leads to both challenges, but also massive opportunities in terms of scalability, because if you get that important local municipality on board, or the local landowners, you can scale up and also demonstrate the benefits that you have had in this particular area that they can then also more easily adapt. Again, requires a lot more knowledge, not least about the ecology, but also about the community values and the governance structures that support or maybe don't support current restoration activities. So the major steps of Waterlands, very, very briefly, I won't go into too much detail on this. First, it's to characterize the ecology, community, governance, and existing finance structures at our knowledge sites and our action sites, KS and AS. The second is to co-create a best practice model that we can apply in particular at our knowledge sites, our action sites, sorry, but then also maybe reflect some of that knowledge back onto our knowledge sites. Number three then is to initiate tangible restoration by 2024, ultimately the crux of all of this. And then also it's to establish legacy that self-perpetuates beyond the life of the project. And that can be through establishing an ecological decision support mechanism, DSM, a multi-stakeholder platform at each of our action sites, fundamental to a lot of what we want to achieve, ensuring that policy engagement and influence is continued throughout the project and goes beyond the project, and then also to establish at some of our key sites financial models that demonstrate that it is actually worthwhile for large companies or even governments themselves to invest in wetland restoration, instead of it just being a nice fluffy thing you do for conservation alone. We can go into great depth on this particular slide, but I won't. The ultimate point of this slide is that all of those 4 work packages at the top that you see filter down through work package 5, co-creation, and then bottleneck through restoration management. So the important point here is that all of that knowledge above here filters down through restoration management, and then in theory or in practice generally will lead to tangible, long-term and scalable restoration. I'm going to stop there. I'm not sure how the timing was there, Caitriona. I think it was around 10:15. I
think you're good. So yeah, that's perfect. Thanks a million, Jane. That was
cool. No
really interesting.
Yeah, I'll take questions.
I'll just, do you want to unshare or do you want
to? Yeah, I can stop sharing now. Yeah.
So has anybody got any questions to start us off? Just raise your hand or put something into the chat. Maybe I can start off. I just had one little, when you were talking about the connection between the knowledge sites and the action sites and that kind of knowledge transfer, knowledge exchange, maybe could you talk a little bit about what kind of mechanisms are there within the project to ensure that that happens at kind of stakeholder platforms or other kinds of infrastructure to kind of get that knowledge from the knowledge sites to the action sites?
Yeah, good point. So we'll have a system of pairing or twinning between knowledge sites and action sites. So I suppose there'll be kind of ambassadors which will transfer knowledge. Now, it doesn't need to be ecological in nature or it doesn't need to be geographically clustered, but we need to ensure that 1 or 2 knowledge sites would be able to viably transfer useful information to a particular action site. So we've got some really good partners on board that are well experienced at this. So Prospects Institute, Plan Bleu, and Wetlands International, who are key partners in all of this, will ensure that we find the right match of knowledge site to action site.
Anybody else? Just raise your hand if you have a question. I haven't seen any. Federico?
I have a question. I saw on the map about there was mentioned the Abilix bog, just coming down to Ireland as a reality. So I've been there, as many of you maybe have been there. So it looks already in quite excellent conditions, I would say. So is there any evaluation that's going to be performed to establish how it actually is going to improve the restoration of this site, or it is not going to be done specifically on this in this wetland?
So Abilix, as you said, is a knowledge site.
Yeah.
Although we would love to spread all of this money across 15 sites and ensure that restoration continues and improves at all of these sites, if we spread it too thin, then we don't get anything done. So Abilix will be representing a knowledge site, not necessarily an action site. Now, what we may do in the future is reflect some of that knowledge back onto Abilix, or some of that experience. What Abilix will be providing, and some of the rest of the Community Wetlands Forum network will be providing, is the vast experience in how to effectively engage with stakeholders at sites, and doing that respectfully and ensuring that it is equitable in nature. We would love to do that with all of our sites. We would also love to do active restoration on all of our sites, but that's simply not practical, unfortunately. But yeah, I saw the photos of you standing in the bog there, Federico. Fair play to you.
It's an ongoing effort, like for everybody.
So I have a question in the chat from Elgar. So it's about work package 2, and it's, which is all about engaging communities. It's just a question on kind of what kind of methods and what kind of tactics are going to be employed.
Work package 2, engaging communities. Yeah, so there's a couple of there's some proprietary mechanisms. Obviously, first and foremost is the standard stakeholder mapping exercise, but then there'll be a lot of collaborative workshops at particular sites, and then starting to cluster them geographically in terms of, let's say, our knowledge sites in Eastern Europe, our knowledge sites in the Mediterranean region, and then Northwestern Europe. We'll then be disaggregating that knowledge and bringing it into work package 5, which is our co-creation work package, to ensure that effectively percolates down into the relevant action sites. It's not going to be easy because we're being ambitious. We've got 6 different action sites across very differing ecological and socioeconomic areas. So it will be challenging to characterize all of those and to try and come up with a common story across it all. The fear of that is that it then becomes too general, and then any specific lessons you try and communicate aren't necessarily effective or engaging enough at particular action sites. So there will be a certain level of tailoring required with that knowledge. I would say that the community engagement doesn't just span the values that people append to their wetland. It also talks about the socioeconomic aspects as well. So do they use it as an amenity? Do they value it in other ways instead of just being simply involved in it?
Okay. Question from McDara. So again, it's kind of following on to that. It's kind of also around community engagement. It's about having a number of civil society partners. What role do you think culture plays in terms of changing attitudes from wastelands to waterlands, and have you done any previous work on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have and we will be integrating pretty strong cultural veins to this project, and one of the important ones is the art project that we will have running. So at each of our action sites, we'll have an artist in residence that will engage with communities from an early stage and then engage on an annual basis to develop particular art pieces. Caitriona, you're going to be leading that part of it as well. And it's that level of softer or differing engagement that I think got us over the line in terms of the application, but will also then ensure that any outputs are a little bit more culturally relevant and a lot more engaging than just yet another scientific report that the usual suspects would read or likely won't read. They'll read the executive summary and it may be implemented. Whereas if you can instill a wider cultural shift in how people perceive these wastelands and then see them rather as valuable wetlands, then the work starts to do itself. Ultimately, one of the fantastic quotes of our kickoff a couple of weeks ago, we asked the whole consortium, what would you like to see from this 5-year project? And one was that at the end of this 5 years, farmers come to you to restore their bogs, not the other way around. In other words, changing the cultural values appended to it, maybe also the financial values to it as well. But in other words, that it self-perpetuates and that you have the communities approaching you because of this novel engagement that you planned from the beginning. I mean, there'll be lots of standard stuff. There'll be leaflets and tweets and websites as well, but there'll also be videos, art installations. Venice in particular will be incredibly good at that. So the local NGO that's involved in this, We Are Here Venice, they have a really strong artistic foundation in their organization already. So I think they'll really help to lead how we develop that a bit more.
Could be the end of project exhibition could be maybe in Venice at the Biennale.
Venice Biennale,
yeah. Anybody else got a question for Shane or a comment?
Hi, Caitriona, I have a question, if you don't want. Shane, very interesting. Maybe I missed it, but there's a huge sort of range. I'm coming from the hydrology end here with the restoration. that you have surface water, groundwater, you have coastal wetlands here. Do you capture all those predominant sources of where the water comes from in your restoration, in the sites that were chosen for restoration?
Not on a project, not on a whole consortium level. That's up to the specific action sites to deal with themselves, and they have local steering groups who would engage with local hydrologists. Some have them on board already, they've contracted them. The purpose of this project is not to delve really deeply into the ecology of it, it's to construct something that goes beyond that. So at early stages, and even right now, we're trying to push back on the really in-depth ecological investigation, because like you say, it's not applicable across the whole network. Yes, it's required at the action sites, and get on with that work where you are, but in terms of feeding that broader knowledge into the network itself, you know, the hydrology of a particular coastal area is of little relevance to the uplands in Culta and Erin. So the purpose here is to, yes, characterize that ecology, learn those lessons, but moreover, identify the challenges in getting that data and then feeding how you dealt with those challenges into the network, not necessarily the specific hydrological challenges of the Venice Lagoon. Which is hard. It's kind of hard to communicate, and it was to the commission at the time as well, that it's not simply a restoration action. If we wanted to spend 23 million on peatland restoration in Ireland, that would actually go not very far at all. The idea of this is that it sets a precedent, it starts to catalyze additional finance, and it creates this ripple effect that, like I said, hopefully starts to perpetuate itself financially and culturally.
Any other questions before we finish up? We probably have time for just one more. And if not, I was just, Shane, you mentioned finance there, and I know one of the partners involved is very much an expert in this kind of financing work. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that just to wrap up. Yeah,
that's really, really strong. The Landscape Finance Lab, which was originally set up as part of WWF, they've now spun out as a separate entity. They have worked on huge landscape level finance programs in the likes of the Congo, Southeast Asia, and now they're looking into Europe, and in particular Ireland, Estonia and Scotland, to develop these long-term investment plans, blended finance, which would pull in private investment, EU investment, European Investment Bank, for example, are now bought in, but others as well. It's tricky because you need to sell a story, I suppose, and we're not used to talking in those ways, and that's why we need to maybe write up a glossary of terms. But it's as much marketing as it is science, and unless you have that investment in, you can't do the science as much as you'd like anyway. So there's a delicate compromise to be reached there in terms of how we approach financiers, potential sources of funding anyway, how we accurately communicate what we want investment for, but then also being true to our values and ensuring that we're not allowing whoever shall to come in and buy it all for us. And then if we eventually get to a stage where, let's say, carbon credits or water credits become available, then where are they going, and whose books are we helping to balance on that? And they're all tricky questions that we don't have immediate answers for, but the Landscape Finance Lab are really good at dealing with some of that. They already have.
A very strong partner to have on board. Okay, unless there's anything else that anybody would like to say, I'll just thank Shane. Thanks very much, Shane. It was really great. Really interesting to get an oversight, and looks like you're going to have a busy 5 years ahead.
Already busy.
All right.
Yeah,
thanks very much.
Virtual hand clappings.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.